over the last year and a half or so, I've been doing some volunteer work through the Planning Institute of Australia, what I call pro bono work about climate change. And one of these buttons, you move things forward, which I think is a big green button. There's two big green buttons. Ah, that one, here.
When people go ask me about technology.
Yeah, that's right. And so about 18 months ago, I was in a voluntary meeting with PIA, and PIA nationally were looking for people in each state to be what was called the climate change champions. And I looked around the meeting and I thought to myself, everybody else works for government. So I ended up sort of picking up the gig, which is okay. And go back. And so I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel a bit like Groot. Spend a lot of time looking to, really grow things, progress things, and just get stuff happening. But then comes a time where you kind of just ignore that things might not be going so well. And as Groot says, you lose all of the growth in a fun variety of natural disasters. And you kind of go, we need to pause. It's not such a good thing that's happening. And I heard about this research recently, which is pretty sobering. So this is 10 years beyond the bushfire report. So this is 10 years after bushfire impact. And 10 years after the fires, 22% of people almost a quarter of people impacted were reporting symptoms consistent with diagnosable mental health issues. That's pretty significant. And down the other one I highlighted was a sense of community cohesion was lower in high impact communities 10 years after the bushfire. So that's research. That's what tells us. So we understand one of the impacts of climate change is in terms of disasters. And we know disasters are quite common, unfortunately. But these are some of the impacts which come from that. So these are things we know, and they certainly aren't going away. The cost of weather-related disasters in Australia, it is simply going up. There's some research the federal government did, I think, a few years back, and it's about 1.6% of GDP. So for the economists, it's a matter of significance to really try to plan for hazards and to then respond for hazards as they do happen. Neil from DEW spoke earlier, and he referenced the same what he called the single source of research about understanding climate projections, and he highlighted the main what's to be expected in terms of climate change over, say, the next 30 years in Australia. And so this slide says the same thing. So it's a single source of truth about climate trends. So higher temperatures, warmer spring temperatures, hotter and more frequent hot days, fewer frosts, declining rainfall, more drought, more intense rainfall events, wind, more dangerous fire weather, rising sea levels, and more acidic oceans. So today, principally I want to go through the 10 asks the Planning Institute of Australia has been pursuing within South Australia, and then just draw some observations. So nationally, mid-last year, PIA commenced a campaign advocating to reform planning systems nationally about climate change matters. PIA itself, I think, has declared the word emergency associated with climate change, so it's a critical area of activity for the Institute. And so nationally, these are the sort of 10 areas that are being looked at. And so part of, I guess, my role as a volunteer in PIA is to think, well, how can we get these localised in South Australia? So number one, okay, before that, so what do I think PIA is actually trying to do with these goals? Or what problems is PIA aiming to fix with these goals? One is, I think it's really wanting planning to be looking at a real climate conscious Australia. In other words, we want to be a very contemporary profession about planning for climate change. In step with real community concern on climate risk, we know we have a new federal government, in part for climate change reasons. For example, It's also very much about increasing planners' own competency about planning for and adapting around climate change. And from this to reform what you would call policy, practice and culture. So how planning is done, basically, which comes very much out of the culture of the profession and so forth. So PIA, how is PIA doing that? It's really about advocating for policy work, better understanding and training. And so as Kate mentioned earlier, she's had a few meetings with the Planning Minister. Climate change is part of that agenda. I had a meeting with Craig Holden from the Commission a few weeks ago on these matters as well. And so that's something PIA is continuing to work on with Plus on these matters. So the asks. This is the sorts of things PIA is asking for. So the first one is for basically the State Commission to work with the Premier's Climate Change Council on a forum with economic, social and environmental stakeholders to understand what different sectors are doing, opportunities for collaboration and what role they see planning doing. Now, stating very clear things, we do have a new state government, a new federal government, and the agenda has changed. And only this week, clearly, the Prime Minister signed the 43% paperwork with whoever it is internationally. So we have to be, South Australia has to be on the leading foot about seizing these opportunities. And planning occasionally needs to pause and operate at a high level and think, what do we really need to achieve? So that's something PIA is asking of the Commission in particular. We know the planning design code is in place. Sally's update this morning of bits of work they're looking at doing is all really important. But we think there does need to be a holistic review of the code's policies, the operational policies, and the practice outcomes against the intent of the state planning policies. Review the state planning policies themselves regarding the Climate Change Action Plan, and do the state planning policies need reform? And we think probably the Commission should establish, maybe do more work on the type of targets they are and reporting on those in terms of climate change. One of the things is about awareness raising and culture change of us as a profession. I think planners, you can call planners generically, but some planners are much more passionate about climate change and hazards and that kind of thing and quite competent. Others are kind of, well, maybe, but there's a need to increase awareness and competency about that generally. So one of our proposals is that the Commission prepare some sort of practice guide or guidelines about what the code does for carbon mitigation and adaptation and the outcomes that's really working towards, the benefits for proponents of development, and use this as a guide to train planners. So picking up the example Martin mentioned before about dark roofs, have some research about that to understand, well, really, what's the benefit of not having dark roofs? And use that as information to train planners so that then they can be a bit more leading edge in practice. And that might lead to some policy change as well. Number 4, is in the code, this is for those who like to read the code, there's a heading called environmental performance. And there are some, what I call sustainable design policies in there. And we think some more work needs to be done on those policies generally. One of our asks is that those policies should technically apply to all forms of performance assessed development. Probably foster greater awareness across the sector about the code's energy efficiency policies in land division and building environmental performance, and to prepare a guideline about allotment layout and building siting and design to foster energy efficiency. So again, this is about increasing understanding and competence of planners. Contemporary hazard planning. So we know Plus is doing some really good work and necessary work in terms of fire and flood, and as Sally said, that's been rolled out across South Australia. And the ask PIA has of that is that that's just, in effect, the proposed policies is road tested to make sure it's workable. We also believe that there's a need to just have a look at what the code does on hazards generally, be it coastal sea level rise, be it landslide or earthquake. I recall there has been 2 earthquakes somewhere near Adelaide in the last 6 months. Just to take stock of all the range of hazards at some point and think, does the planning system need to do something more? Hazards are a real issue, as we know. This particular photo is Middle Beach. just north of the city. About 100 people live there, and it is at risk. It's just an example of what is around the place. In regional planning, we know regional planning is work that is getting underway now. The regional plans in South Australia, if you haven't looked at them, they are quite dated, 8 to 10 years old. So clearly they are a priority to update. URPS undertook some work called Supporting Climate Smart Regional Plans last year. That work isn't actually public information, but we're trusting URPS did a really great job. We won a PIA award, etc., etc. So we think that work should be a valuable input into regional planning across South Australia. So that's one of the asks we're looking at for resilient strategies. Along with producing guidelines, we think it's important that there be some training to understand how the code facilitates carbon mitigation and adaptation through renewables. So I confess I don't know a whole lot about exactly what the code says on renewables, so I could go and do some training. But if we're looking to foster take-up of renewables, I know there was some work, actual policy work done, and the code's pretty current about renewables, but there should be some greater awareness raising and training so that as a sector we're really upskilled about renewables. One of the asks PIA put forward nationally is this thing called precinct carbon, or precinct carbon approaches. And this is an interesting one because it's something I had to go and do a bit of research on, a bit of thinking about myself. And the basic proposition is that if precincts or areas of towns or suburbs are, if you like, designed, developed, managed effectively, it reduces the amount of carbon that comes out of that area. On one level, you could say South Australia as a whole is a precinct, but this is we're very much looking to localise it. There has been some work done in Canberra and different jurisdictions which outline some of the benefits in terms of carbon reduction of approaches to precincts. And the little sort of image there highlights, if you like, the range of activities that are involved in that. I think it's fair to say it's probably important that or also the ask PIA is really putting forward is that the government take a whole of government policy approach to carbon at the precinct level. Do some initial research, some initial consideration around what might be the regulatory and policy reforms needed, what might be the role of the state planning policies and the code explicitly about low carbon precincts. Look at some pilot options with the private sector. I'm sure there's work underway that developers and so forth are doing, and to prepare some guideline around that. It's an area that hasn't really been looked at that comprehensively in South Australia, in my understanding, so I think it's an area that should be looked at. Trees and native vegetation. So this has obviously been an area of a lot of discussion for a long time. The asks PIA has really been asking for is that there be a comprehensive review of the tree offset scheme and the on-site tree code policies and the regulated and significant tree provisions that are in the code and the Act. And so I just put there the Open Space and Trees project that the State Planning Commission has commenced. From a general perspective, that looks like it's really investigating those two areas in detail. I certainly I sit on an assessment panel and I understand the role of soft landscaping and urban tree policy and the change that it's bringing about in developments that are coming through, which is good. But we also know, for instance, regulated and significant trees, the current statutory and policy arrangements have been in place for 10 years, and there are some questions about that. So the Commission is looking at that. However, the Native Vegetation Act, for instance, which operates outside of Metro Adelaide, so it hasn't been comprehensively reviewed for a long time, and there's some questions around really how well that's operating in practice. And so our ask is there really be a comprehensive review of the Native Vegetation Act at some point in time. And that Act's a pretty good example of where the Act's actually under the Environment Minister, different department, the planning world interacts with it, with referrals and that kind of thing. So I understand that. But as we understand, native vegetation is clearly important, and there's a need to have a look at that. And lastly is about what we could call all things active transport related. Interestingly, if you look at the state planning policies about the role of planning, active transport is actually one of the key roles of planning, is to foster active transport in the state planning policies. So just let that sit. If you read it, it actually says that. So, but there's a need for more work on that generally, and the types of asks that we're looking for from the Commission is to have a look at the state planning policies themselves, the regional plans and the code, to actually prioritise active transport rather than see active transport as part of the transport mix. So at the strategic level, to make it a priority. Last year, there was a walking strategy prepared, a walking action plan. I think Shanti and Natasha from Wellbeing SA are talking about that this afternoon. But there's some actions in there for Plus to progress in terms of walking in the planning system. So PIA is saying, great, just let's see those actions done over time. Ensure the state planning policies and code is current in regards to electric vehicle charging stations. It's clearly a trend that's happening. And to foster awareness in planning about transport demand management. And that's about increasing the competency and awareness of planners about the role of planning and land use and transport demand. So some observations for planners. Clearly, well, most Western countries actually have a pretty high livability. South Australia's got a pretty high livability, and that's really a legacy of the past. I remember when the wind farm policy came into development plans 20 odd years ago, and that really enabled certainty for investment in that and led a lot of good investment, so to speak. So we are pretty well positioned for the future, and so that's something we can't forget. What I call the architecture of the planning system, it's pretty solid, but reform is needed really across policy, be regional planning as well as operational work in assessment. Planners need to show and be enabled to show leadership in this. We need to link, if you like, the ask on sites to the strategic level, be it if you're doing an assessment work or in a code. And planners need to tell the livable climate story. And I thought I'd just get a bit practical here based on the BMW redevelopment down at Glenelg. So for those, I'm on an assessment panel at Holdfast Bay. And this particular development came past a couple of weeks ago. So for the record, I'm only going to say what would have been said in the public arena at the meeting. And so this is a $5 million redevelopment, car showroom, you know, the sort of thing that car dealerships have. And when you look at the code, there are some environmental sustainability performance outcomes in the code. And I read all of the material in the development application, the assessment reports, and it was silent on that altogether. And I thought to myself, well, so I emailed the assessment manager a few days before the meeting and said, just give the applicant a heads up, we'll just ask a question about that during the panel meeting. So we did, and they said some of the initiatives they'll be putting into the building, and it got granted consent. Subject to a reserve condition about on-site landscaping, the soft landscaping, and that's got to be worked through. But to me, it illustrates one of the challenges we have as a planning sector around how far to go in planning, in influencing individual developments, and what tools do we particularly need for developments like this sort of one. Now, how does that relate, for instance, to the similar sorts of asks for housing, for instance, or for childcare centres? And what particular tools do we as planners need for that? Because we do need to get down to the practical level of an actual development. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. And I just think it's fantastic to see PIA leading this conversation at the national level. And I just want to pay tribute to David as one of the many volunteers at the state level that actually helps get things done. So good on you for stepping up into that space. We have got a few minutes if there are any particular questions of David. We might just go with yelling out from where you are, if that's all right. Yeah. Oh, here we are.
So increased temperatures, less rain, more intermittent rain activity. But nothing's talked about rural economy, agricultural economy, thinking about transitioning crops or various uses around. That's going to present a huge issue to rural and peri-urban councils, where if farming or agriculture becomes more difficult, you're going to see more people leaving the land, obviously moving into cities, creating more problems with infill and that. Has any of that been integrated or given consideration, how agricultural land uses will be impacted and what the planning system can do to help keep farming in the regions?
I've got a few different hats I'm involved in, and through the PIA work, PIA volunteer work, I think the answer being transparent is not in detail, but I will reference some discussions at Adelaide Plains Council, and David Roberts is here as well from Adelaide Plains Council, insofar as which is peri-urban, and it's interesting, Neil from DW said earlier, Adelaide Plains is going to be experiencing a lot of heat and drought, and I thought, well, that's an interesting challenge, but there's I don't know the details, but there's a particular land division proposal lodged in some horticulturally zoned land, which is below what the code expects in terms of land division size, and so they've got some expert advice as part of that proposal, and as council administration we'll be seeking some expert advice to review that as well around, if you like, how viable are those proposed allotments in terms of being able to actually run horticulture on that. And that involves, I think, agricultural economists, some of those experts in that. So I think that will be interesting to understand how much they consider the heat trend and the availability of water, that sort of thing. But that's here, let alone a bit further north, out, past Barra and Terari, those sorts of areas. So it's a really good question. I think it would be good for you to talk to Neil Vincent from DW on that, because it certainly does go to the future of all of those sort of far's not quite the word, out in the bush farming areas.
Thanks, David. Are there any more questions for David? It's a big agenda, but breaking it down and, the bite-sized chunks is an important way of, so I think the 10 asks idea is a really good way to go about it. No other questions for David? Oh, yes, we have one at the back. Yeah. Is that mic coming? May as well wait for it.
David, no doubt you're expecting a question from me again. So I'm just really interested in how PNSA is working with some of the planners who are really leading and understanding that the interconnection between planning and climate change, like Professor Barbara Norman and people like that interstate, and how we can pick up perhaps in this state on what has been done in other states and overseas as well. Just so people know, I'm a land use planner, but I also manage the state government's climate change unit for a period of time as well. So this is an area close to my heart, and I know there's lots of opportunities that we can look at in the planning area.
So that's a question? Yeah.
The question was, the first bit was about how are we in South Australia with PIA working with people who are leading in this space interstate, so with people who are planners like Dr. Barbara Norman. She's a planner, she's also an academic, and she looks at those intersections between planning and climate change and has for many, many years.
Yeah, I think it's probably something we could do more of. I know there are different climate change champions across different jurisdictions in Australia, and I have to confess I haven't really talked with them a great deal, which is possibly an opportunity to do, so I'll probably pursue that afterwards, I think.
I think there's the opportunity too, because Barbara was a former national president, and so, I think she's probably had some, at that national level, helping us form up that agenda. But we need to use the resources that we have, people like Barbara, to actually make the intersection clear so people in our profession who want to do the best thing know what it is. Stephen, just a quick one, if you, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah, hi Michelle. I'm the PIA National Director, and I also now sit on PIA's National Policy Advisory Committee, and I think Sally Roberts from SA, so we've actually just brought in a representative from each of the state on that group to look at how we do work more across Australia on these policy issues. So clearly climate change is one of those. So I think now we've actually established this group, there will be those better cross connections. So I think it's about watching that space in the coming 12 months.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. And Michelle, your institute's onto it. That's good news. We might thank David again. Thanks so much for that. And, you know, PIA exists largely on the work that people do beyond their day jobs, so it's really important. I'd just like to move on to, I will just for a minute there. I'm actually a former board director of Bicycle Queensland and current board director of Queensland Walks, which is our pedestrian advocacy body. So I'm a long-term advocate in this area. So Dr. Jennifer Bonham, who's with us, adjunct senior research fellow at the University of South Australia, co-founded the Master of Planning programs at the University of Adelaide, and has spent 30 years designing and managing urban mobility and transport research projects across government, private industry, university sector, and in the last 15 years has focused on active transport and especially the rapidly emerging field of cycling. The most successful sort of communities in the world, like Vancouver, put active transport number one. You know, it's a really timely conversation. It's our 10th action area. So if you join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Bonham to the stage.
Okay, thanks for having me. Now, I'll just have to... So today I'm speaking on behalf of the Transport Action Network, and this group has formed probably over the last 18 months where a variety of community groups who have been impacted by major road widening projects, as well as public transport, walking and cycling advocacy groups, have come together, as well as researchers, urban planners and transport planners. So really there's kind of been this community bubbling away concern about transport and what's going on, particularly in local neighbourhoods. And I suppose a concern that our Department of Transport doesn't really seem to listen when communities are concerned about what's going on in their area. So we've got this growing network now of these different organisations and individuals who are really concerned about transport. And particularly this idea that over the last 5 years we've had this absolute smorgasbord of studies, strategies, plans done, but there doesn't seem to be an overarching strategy. And sure, we've got the 30-year plan, and that does say great things about walking and cycling and active travel, but it doesn't seem to really connect with what our transport people are doing. So there's this disconnect between our overarching land use plan and our transport plan. And if we follow the money, and I put this slide together because one of the local community groups were outraged that you could possibly spend $25 million building a bike overpass. And so I just did a quick summary of 10 major intersections being built or have been completed around Adelaide in the last few years, and that came to over $350 million. And so just to make those local groups aware of how much money we do put into road projects. And of course, that's notwithstanding the $10 billion that we're about to spend on the North-South corridor, if that goes ahead. And so, you know, you compare this almost $300 per head for Greater Adelaide residents. And when you compare that with what we've been spending on cycling infrastructure, it pales into the cycling fund pales into insignificance. So, and that hasn't really improved with the latest state budget. So, of course, the transport sector, as we know, is a growing sector of greenhouse gas emissions. So, and that is both in proportion of overall greenhouse gas emissions as well as absolutely. So in 1990, our greenhouse gas emissions from transport was around 9.7% of overall greenhouse gases, and last year it had almost doubled to 18%. And that's not just because other sectors are shrinking, that, as I said, is also in absolute terms. So in 1990, it was about 60 megatons of greenhouse gases pumped into the atmosphere by the transport sector. In just before the pandemic, it was around 95 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions. That dropped during the pandemic, but as you can see, that little blip uptick at the end there, it's on the way up. And so that is, when we actually look at the basis of that, we can see that road transport accounts for 85% of our transport emissions. When you think about the rail emissions at 4%, now rail apparently takes half of the nation's freight, and this also includes our passenger transport network. So 4% of emissions for half the freight and our passenger transport network. Our automobiles, trucks and buses and light commercial vehicles, that's 85% of greenhouse gas emissions. So, and of that, of those transport sector greenhouse gas emissions, automobiles are almost responsible for almost half of those emissions. And when we come to the urban environment, it's normally put at around 60, just over 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we've got a lot of work to do in decarbonising our transport sector. There was a lot of work, a lot of enthusiasm in the early 1990s around transport and how we really could, transport had a lot, it could work a lot and help a lot with reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And then that kind of disappeared through the late 90s, 2000s. But now that we're getting our stationary energy emissions, kind of starting to get them on the track to renewables, attention is returning to the transport sector and how we need to actually do something on emissions within the transport sector. We also know that there are a number of other environmental challenges related to our current forms of transport. So here we've got some protesters out on Friends of Old Belair Road, and they are part of our network where they've actually managed to pause a major road roundabout and road widening project that was going to destroy some really precarious and important native bushland. So that's been paused under the current government, but we know that our roads are important in terms of urban heat, impermeable surfaces, and of course the water pollution that ends up in our marine environments, both in our local waterways and in our marine environments. So as soon as our rain hits the road, it effectively is contaminated. And so, yes, we're doing all sorts of things to address those environmental issues around transport and around road transport in particular, but are we doing them quickly enough, and can they actually address those overall environmental challenges? I suppose along with that, and this is what really got me into the field of transport over 30 years ago and provoked my interest in transport, were the equity issues around transport. And I'm sure most people in this room have read the work of Dodson and Saipi, where they talk about the mortgage belts, particularly in our outer urban areas, where people effectively have very little choice but to drive cars. Those cars, particularly in the South Australian context, RAA put it a few years ago at $5,500 per vehicle to own and operate a vehicle. Under the current petrol pricing, that has gone up. I haven't done the calculations, but that's clearly gone up. So, and people in those outer suburbs generally have to have in a household at least 2 cars. So for a state that has one of the is the second lowest average income, that can be a pretty hefty amount of money that people are forking out over the year simply for transport. So there's those affordability issues. There's of course also that whole lack of access. If you don't have a driver's licence, those age brackets between 18 to 80, and a lot of those people who do have a driver's licence don't necessarily drive or don't have access to a vehicle. So in South Australia we do have this transport disadvantage where at least around about 10% of our households in Greater Adelaide, just under 10%, don't have access to or don't have a motor vehicle in the household. So that ranges from around 35% of households in Adelaide LGA through to Norwood. It's about 12% of households don't have access to a motor vehicle, and then in the hills it's around 2 to 3% of households don't have motor vehicles. So you might have the motor vehicle in the household, but doesn't mean you have access to the motor vehicle. And if you do have access to the motor vehicle, then what does that mean for those people who have those carer roles and having to chauffeur others in that household around? And of course then we also know those issues around community severance with a large road infrastructure, or even smaller arterial roads that people simply can't get across because the motor vehicles actually form that mobile barrier to getting across it. So health and safety, those issues around road safety, etc., sedentary lifestyles, which is what a lot of the active travel people are concerned about, is the sedentary lifestyles that are facilitated by people effectively having very little choice but to own and operate a motor vehicle. And then, of course, there's the opportunity costs associated with so much land being taken up for motor vehicles. So that's both directly, so that's the road infrastructure itself, but also the land around that road infrastructure that is difficult to use because of that, the density, the volumes of motor vehicle traffic. So, of course, this is out of Engineers Australia. I borrowed this one from Engineers Australia. So they're arguing that in order to keep emissions below, greenhouse gas emissions and warming below 1.5 degrees, this is what we need to do within the transport sector. So avoid making those journeys altogether. When we do make those journeys, to be able to shift them to active modes, and I include in that scooting and skating, as well as improving the technologies that we do have. So in terms of, and getting people onto public transport and improving those technologies themselves. So barriers to change. So I often hear that, well, South Australians, they just love their cars. So we're never going to move them out of their cars. They love them. I think it's important to recognise, and this is where much of my research has been, in looking at how our car culture has been produced over the last 100 years. And starting right early in the 1910s, there were arguments and debates around whether or not we should move in the direction of allowing motor vehicles in our streets, but also things like the Move On bylaw. That used to be for getting loafers out of the streets and prostitutes out of the street. In the 1910s, it started to be used to get pedestrians out of the street, to stop them congregating and chatting in the street because they were inconveniencing the motorists. So here, there's court cases around how this Move On clause was being used. There's the jaywalking bylaw, so that pedestrians had to cross directly across the road instead of being able to walk diagonally along the road, because walking diagonally along the road slowed the motorists down. The few motorists who in Adelaide at the time actually had a motor vehicle, there weren't that many in the 1910s. And then, of course, we have the debates around garaging your motor vehicle in the street. And of course, garaging the motor vehicle is what we call today on-street parking. And as a local ward councillor, you try and take away the on-street parking, and that's a serious battle. But it wasn't always this way. So 1910s, we had this kind of, these debates, these rigorous debates going on. Then we get the Look Both Ways Club in the 1930s, where the kids are taught that they're responsible for their safety in crossing the road. We get in the 1960s, we get the Road Traffic Act, which for the first time says that roads are mainly for use by motor vehicles. I'm not sure, at a time when most people still walked and rode their bicycles to employment, etc., not sure how we come up with the idea that roads are mainly for motor vehicles. But we also, in the Metropolitan Plan of 1962, we actually have anyone who walked or cycled simply weren't counted in those databases. So they only counted people who drove motor vehicles. So the point here is that it's taken a long time to build this motor vehicle culture. I've just come off a research project where we're looking at how motorists were taught to interact safely with cyclists. And we looked at all of the driver licensing materials across Australia, and we found that pedestrian cyclists and children were generally referred to in most jurisdictions in teaching learner drivers how to drive. They were referred to as hazards. So very little surprise that we then get motorists saying that cyclists are hazards on the road and shouldn't be on the road. So here, I checked a few weeks ago our driver licensing material, and fortunately we had someone from DIT on that project, and it's changed, but I'm not sure whether it goes far enough in that change. But there are still other states that are fostering this kind of culture. So that's, I think, one of our main barriers to actually a shift is recognising that what we have now has been culturally produced over 100 years, and it can change. Might take a while to change, but it can. Also, I would argue that our low-density cities have started, along with Paul Mees, a colleague from RMIT, that low-density cities, it started to be used as an excuse not to provide things like public transport. It couldn't possibly work because our cities are such low density. So I think that's a real concern. And I actually think there's a huge opportunity here in South Australia for us to demonstrate how low density can be pedestrian cycling, scooting and skating friendly. I think we've actually got opportunities to sit down and think about how we might actually do that. Also, and this picks up on the work that Zoe in an earlier session was talking about, disabling environments. So here, the photo in the top what would it be for you? It's the top left, is, this is in Mount Barker. We have a lot of space here devoted to being able to park your car, but we've got, in the pedestrian way, we've got all sorts of posts and strobe poles and things like that. So this is a disabling environment. And we've got a similar thing over there, top right, in Parkside. So from Mount Barker to Parkside, we've actually created these disabling environments. So I think a challenge for us, an interesting challenge, is to say, okay, how do we make them enabling environments? We've got limited space and we've got a lot to fit in there. So how can we be imaginative about how we configure that space to allow a diversity of travellers in those kinds of spaces? So that the classic thing of the pedestrian path on one side of the road, and then here in that middle photo, those middle photos, basically the pedestrian, very narrow strip for the pedestrian to walk along, and then they have to cross over to the other side of the road to continue their journey. So some pretty basic things, and this is an area where motorists actually travel around it at around 50 kilometres an hour. So it's actually quite difficult and for pedestrians to navigate and negotiate some of these streets safely. Okay, so there are changes already underway, and this is, I think, really important in that we already have micro-mobility underway. So we've already got scooting, whether it's scooting on your gopher or if it's scooting on your beam, on your Neuron scooter, or hopefully within time we'll actually see people being allowed to use their scooters, their privately owned scooters, on public roads. So as they do in Canberra, they're allowed in public spaces, the privately owned scooters. Here they're not. So hopefully over time we will see that shift. So we've got all of these things, all of this plethora of things happening. So share vehicles, having dedicated parking spaces like they do here in the City of Adelaide, to share vehicles, to reduce the number of vehicles a household has to own to one or perhaps even none. Mobility as a service is on the horizon, and I believe the RAA is soon to release their app for mobility as a service, where people can actually choose a range of services, sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription, and then use a range of public transport, so on and so forth. And also we, of course, have bicycle collection and deliveries on the road. But what it's going to mean is rethinking the public space of the street to enable this diversity of mobilities. Automated vehicles, David Hencher, I'm sure people in the room are familiar with David Hencher. He's been around as Professor of Transport for a very long time. And, his argument is that we may well see an increase, depending on the regulation and ownership of automated vehicles. There is a very good chance that we will see an increase in vehicles on the road and an increase in our congestion. So we have the little bus, the brightly coloured bus at the top there, was operating on trial in Renmark a few years ago. Apparently the trial was very successful. I haven't seen any evaluations of it, and I've talked to transport colleagues of mine and they haven't seen evaluations. So anyone in the room know where the evaluation is, that would be great. But apparently it was successful, but after the trial it was ended. So it wasn't implemented. In Kera, in Finland, I've just been doing some work on that, Kera in Finland. They're actually operating automated vehicles in a brownfield site that they're redeveloping as a circular economy site. When they talk about circular economy in Kera, in Finland, they talk about it at a very detailed level. So they are very much into shared vehicles and into reducing that consumption in the first instance. In the lower pictures here, there's those solar panels that covering the bike path in the middle of the road in South Korea. Don't know if it'd be a great place to ride my bicycle, but the idea of solar panels actually being used in this context, particularly with climate change when we're thinking about increases in temperatures. So I've kind of thought, well, maybe as one of our organisations is talking about the freight bypass around Adelaide, then maybe it could be interrelated with our things like solar panels. Okay, so the Transport Action Network, we kind of realise that there's not an overarching direction for. Well, there is, but it's unstated, our overarching direction in South Australia, because much of that money is being spent still on roads for private motor vehicles and for freight vehicles. So what we're arguing is that we need an integrated transport and land use plan that actually provides genuine transport choice. And here we're thinking about mixed mobility. So instead of thinking everyone just wants to use their car for every journey they make, thinking, okay, is my bike the best one for this journey? Is my share scooter the best one? Is my share motor vehicle the best one? So we're actually calling on the state government to initiate an integrated transport and land use plan. We're talking to federal politicians about making sure that any funding is based not on the whims of a politician in an outer suburb or regional area, but that it's connected to that integrated transport and land use plan. So we need those mechanisms in place to make sure that when our state government actually asks for money, it is actually aligns with this plan. At the moment, we're talking to local communities because we figure that that's the only way that we can actually get people thinking beyond what they already know. So we realise the importance because people have probably had fairly bad experiences of public transport, of walking, of cycling. So we need to actually talk to local communities about other possibilities and give them that information. We also want to provide or get feedback from those local communities as well. And this is how part of building a groundswell around this. And then talking to peak bodies who are already on the path to the decarbonisation and greater equity in our transport systems. So I don't expect you to read this, but rather than actually coming up with set things, like the transport and urban planners in our network, they have billions of ideas about how we can actually better integrate transport with land use, unbundling car parking from our developments in the first place, picking ideas from Houghton in the Netherlands about how they've done that unbundling and so on. So, you know, we have a plethora of ideas about how we might do this, but really we want this to be to come from a broader, well-informed, engaged community, and I think we can have that if we can well inform our community. Unley Council's just done or is in the middle of a process called Shaping Unley, and they're demonstrating how you can inform your community and they can come up with really smart ideas. So watch out for our next agenda. So the guiding principles are access for everyone, genuine transport choice, so in terms of convenience, connectedness, affordability and safety, and to be carbon neutral. So that's what we're asking for. And so we have this vision that all South Australians have genuine transport choices that are convenient, connected, affordable, safe and carbon free. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jennifer. It's covered so much ground and so much data there. It's brilliant. I think I would just want to compliment you and your colleagues in starting the Transport Action Network. I think the collaboration of a number of groups and number of minds is really powerful. You may be aware of Greater Auckland, the advocacy group in Auckland that spent 10 years and has a very significant effect now on their transport policy. So these things can be really, really powerful. So great stuff. We do have time for one or two questions, I think, if anyone's got one for Jennifer before we finish for lunch. There we go, at the back and then at the front, yeah. Just behind you, mate, there's a... Yep. All right, cheers, Terry.
Thanks, Jennifer. I guess one question is whether you're aware of any research, particularly in Adelaide context, about the potential impact of obviously move to electric vehicles, whether that's going to increase, decrease, remain the same in terms of the amount of vehicles on the road and the demands on our road transport network. And clearly it's obviously going to have some impacts on greenhouse gas emissions as well, and whether there's been any modelling done on that.
Yeah, I have looked. I haven't looked in detail at EVs, and yes, they are going to help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But at this moment, they are more more emissions intensive in their manufacture. So our ordinary vehicles, I think they're around 10 tonnes of carbon in the emissions. Our EVs around 13 tonnes. And in the recycling, they also fall down on the recycling of the componentry and everything in terms of emissions. So at this stage, they're kind of not the whole answer. They certainly are going to play a role, an important role. My sense is that if we can actually have our EVs as share vehicles, so that means local governments making sure that they've got charging stations locally, and I believe our federal government is about to roll out charging stations, etc., etc. And so they will be part of the solution, but the research I've seen is that they're likely to only reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 20% when you take into account the life cycle of the vehicles. So obviously with technological changes that's going to improve, and yes, they are part of the mix. In terms of freight, and I haven't had a chance to check this out, but one of the members of our group, the South Australian Transport Action Group, has recently reported that freight vehicles, the batteries in them will actually increase significantly the weight of freight vehicles. And so that's also got implications for the road infrastructure. So even if everyone changed over to EVs tomorrow, we still have that road infrastructure. We still have equity issues and so on and so forth. So yes, absolutely, they're going to be an important, well, they're on the way. They're going to happen. The quicker the better, but they're not going to solve all of our issues.
I like to think of electric vehicles aren't a silver bullet, but they might be part of the silver buckshot, Yeah. So we might just finish there, and thank you so much, Jennifer, for that wonderfully informative and presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.